Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. This week on the program, we must stick together, says the Commonwealth Secretary General ahead of the Commonwealth Health Ministers meeting this week. In a Channels TV exclusive, she tackles coping with the lockdown and efforts that could bring us closer to ending the pandemic. Then, as more Nigerian evacuees return to the country, we talk about their rights and provisions made for their health and safety. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap, but first a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back. Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University, New York, Jeffrey Sachs, says the Trump administration is playing a game of blaming China for its poor performance in fighting against COVID-19, which has become their explicit political tactic. He expressed his views in some politicians fabricating preposterous allegations and lies of one kind or another in order to shift the blame to China for their inadequate response to COVID-19.
Rather than looking at America's problems and trying to solve them, Trump has blamed China for America's problems, whether it's the loss of jobs, the loss of competitiveness, now the deaths from COVID-19. Trump doesn't take responsibility, but rather tries to blame China. And unfortunately, this kind of propaganda works because there are at least some people in any society that rally to nationalism and blame the other side, even when the problems really are at home. And this is working in the United States, unfortunately, as a political tactic, but it's a very dangerous one.
Meanwhile, the leading scientific advisor to the British government, Professor Peter Horby, says drug companies should not be allowed to make big profits from any medication that effectively tackles the COVID-19 virus. He says the poorest people in the world should have access to drugs like remdesivir if proven effective. Speaking on the BBC's Andrew Marr show, Professor Horby said the solution could include the use of more than one antiviral to kill off the virus, coupled with other medications to tackle inflammation caused by the body's reaction to foreign bodies.
It's important that there's a global solidarity around these issues. There should be no opportunity for drug companies making vast profits from these drugs. Everyone across the world, whatever their income, including in the poorest countries, should have access to drugs like this. And they need to be made, if they work, they need to be licensed out for generic production so that they can be made available to everyone at cost price.
South Korea's President Moon Jae-in has warned of a second wave of the coronavirus later this year, saying the recent cluster underscored the risks that the virus, which causes COVID-19, can spread widely again at any time. South Korea reported 34 new coronavirus cases on Sunday, the highest daily number in a month, after a small outbreak emerged around a slew of nightclubs that a confirmed patient had visited. Of the new cases, 26 were domestically transmitted infections and 8 were imported cases, according to the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Finally, the Venezuelan military says it has seized 3 abandoned Colombian light combat vessels that soldiers found on Saturday while patrolling the Orinoco River several days after the government accused its neighbor of aiding a failed invasion. The Defense Ministry says the boats were equipped with machine guns and ammunition but had no crew, adding they were discovered as part of a nationwide operation to guarantee Venezuela's freedom and security. The Colombian Navy says, according to preliminary investigation, the boats were dragged away by strong river currents. International organizations are lending their voices to efforts at curbing the coronavirus. Last week, we heard from the President of the UN General Assembly, Mr. Mohamed Tijani Bande, on how the organization's work has been impacted by the pandemic and how agencies within the UN have continued despite restriction on duties. Another organization is the Commonwealth, which says countries should maintain essential health care to non-COVID-19 patients while dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. Secretary-General Patricia Scotland said this ahead of the Commonwealth Health Ministers meeting holding virtually this week. She points out that some countries have temporarily suspended cancer treatments and surgery to help hospitals manage an influx of COVID-19 patients. At the same time, contagion suppression tactics such as lockdowns and border closures have limited the delivery of mosquito nets, insect repellents, and vaccination schedules. A study by the Johns Hopkins University predicts that about 1 million women and children could die in the next 6 months because the pandemic is disrupting routine health services in low and middle income countries. A couple of weeks ago, Ms. Scotland, in her weekly letter, pointed out the impacts the coronavirus could have on economies. She says history has shown that with the right policies and support measures in place, the Commonwealth as a whole will eventually be able to overcome the economic fallout, though there are extremely bleak times ahead. She then talks about the Commonwealth advantage, which lies in historic ties, familiar legal and administrative systems, a common language, and large dynamic diasporas, which help make trade and investment more convenient and efficient. The Commonwealth advantage, she says, enables member countries to trade up to 20% more with each other than with non-members at a 21% low cost on average. So, strengthening the connectivity among member countries is critical so that trade flows remain resilient during times of crisis. She did speak more about the Commonwealth advantage and other issues surrounding the coronavirus pandemic with my colleague, Millicent Walker.
Well, one of the good things about our Commonwealth is we are 54 countries, that's 2.4 billion people, and 60% of our people are under the age of 30, so we have a powerhouse. But the things that join us are really important. We share the same language, the same common law, the similar structures in terms of governance. And that gives us a 19% advantage when we trade with one another. Our systems reflect one another, and there's a great deal of compatibility. So over the years, we've identified this Commonwealth advantage for doing business, and we've been able to start now to positively exploit it. Up until last year, we identified that the amount of trade between our Commonwealth family of 54 was $700 billion. We anticipate that it may be possible to increase that to $2 trillion by 2030. And this opportunity is made even more sharp by two things. The first is we have the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement. And because our systems are so similar, and because we've got this 19% advantage, and we settle our disputes 20% more quickly, we can work together to make sure the boulders that are getting in the way for our trade can be moved out, and so that we can accelerate the amount of trade between us. So that's one. But the second, which is even more important, particularly for Africa, is the creation of the African Free Trade Area. And that, you know, was agreed, and it was supposed to come in July, and we're hoping that it still will do. But Nigeria has done a great deal on that, but we know so has the other AU countries, and that Ghana is going to have the secretariat. So we here in the Commonwealth not only helped to facilitate that in the AU by giving our expertise and our experts, but we have continued to commit to the African Union and to the African Free Trade Area to try and make sure that we can ease the trade between us. And we're going to need that trade, and we're going to need that acceleration even more. And some people are suggesting that the African Free Trade Area could generate as much as $2.5 billion worth of trade. Now, when you know that we are going to be facing an economic tsunami after this pandemic, we will need that trade more than ever before.
We're still talking about the trade. As it stands now, we have several countries with several restrictions and movement. So how is trade working now as, you know, countries are battling the pandemic?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the fear is that we are likely to face a worse recession than we saw in the Great Depression after the World War. We know that we went through an economically, financially difficult position in 2008. The figures coming out of the IMF and all the analysis that is being made on the global arena, and indeed the analysis that we in the Secretariat are making ourselves, is this is going to be a tsunami when it comes to the economic impact of COVID. And it's for that reason that we believe it is essential that we prepare, analyse and implement the sort of things that will be making a difference. And here in the Commonwealth, we have set up a whole series of webinars that are going to start on the 13th of this month, because we have to pool the brightest and the best from right across the Commonwealth to help us to analyse what's coming our way and to find some of the solutions and the pathways.
There have been a number of, for example, the African Centre for Disease Control talked about the difficulty of African countries getting diagnostic tools in Africa. What role can the Commonwealth play in also helping to flatten the curve in Africa? I mean, the World Health Organization has talked about a number of fears with regards to how Africa is managing the spread.
Yeah, well, what we have done is immediately this became a big issue. We decided that we would pull together everything that's known, everything that works, but also equally all the things that have not been working, so that we can share that information between us. And we created on our website, which is thecommonwealth.org, a coronavirus resource center. And in that resource center, we created a tracker specifically directed to our 54 countries, so that we can monitor not only what is happening, but what are the solutions that are being successfully implemented by our different countries, and sharing those solutions. And we've also been helping to identify with a greater degree of specificity the sort of analytical assessments that our countries will need to put themselves into a better position. Because some of this work cannot be viewed in isolation. We know that there's an intersection right now between the COVID pandemic, but also many of our countries are having to deal with the climate crisis. You have seen what's happened in the Pacific with the storms and the Category 5 cyclones, which has devastated there. We've seen in Kenya the floods coming, but then in other countries we have locusts, and we have desertification, and we have problems. So what we've done in the Coronavirus Resource Center is to put all those resources at the fingertips of our member states. And we've not just relied on our own information, but we've used the 90 accredited organizations who are Commonwealth organizations to help us.
Finally, what kind of policies and measures do you think that governments across member countries should be putting in place? And this is to also help protect the vulnerable groups this period.
Well, the first thing we know that's been very effective is the countries who have sought to implement the recommendations made by the World Health Organization, and that's been very helpful. But we absolutely have to focus on universal health coverage. That is something all of our health ministers identified before this virus, and we know also it's what we needed to respond better to things like the Ebola epidemic. So we have to learn, because the tragedy for us is this pandemic may not be our last pandemic. And we have to not only deal with this one, but we've got to make sure that if anything else happens, we're ready to deal with the next one too. My major thing to say to everybody is we can do this. The last generation that was faced with something as awful as the pandemic were in the 1940s during perhaps the Second World War. The Commonwealth came together then and we fought together and we won. I think we can be a beacon yet again and to show the way. So a big thank you for Africa, big thank you to the President and the Cabinet, big thank you for the leadership and the solidarity. I believe that together we will succeed. We can't do it on our own, but I'm confident we can do it if we stick together.
When we come back after the break, Nigeria makes her first evacuations of citizens from abroad during the pandemic. We'll talk about it. Stay with us.